Hi everyone, we're going to get started now. First of all, thank you so much for being here today. My name is Meg. I'm one of the co-coordinators along with Alexis Rodriguez Camacho and Chang with the CRC. So this is the 8th year of Theories in Action, and it's really meant to be an interdisciplinary conversation where seniors can think about their academic and co-curricular commitments and what it's meant to them and to their communities. So today our roundtable is titled Reclaiming Identity, and with that I'll turn it over to our facilitator, Chang.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's so lovely to see you all here. Just to give you a sense of what to expect, we'll be pretty much staying seated and talking from the tables. There is a slide presentation. We're going to be probably in conversation with you for about an hour and a half. Feel free to get up and get food and use the restrooms if you need to. Theories in Action is meant, you'll notice that we're calling these conversations roundtables rather than panel discussions. So we're hoping for this to be truly a dialogue between the panelists, the speakers, and with you. So I'm going to do my best to facilitate that dialogue. This group has actually met to kind of think about how they want to present. I think my role is going to be very minimal, so I'm really just going to turn it over to you all. And let me just make sure this works. This works. This is awesome. Okay, so take it away, Lisa and company. And do you want me to manage this?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay, awesome.
Cool. So we're going to introduce ourselves before we...
And make sure you speak into the mic. Yeah, thanks.
We're going to introduce ourselves. Okay, my name's Lisa. I study English nonfiction. I'm a senior editor at the College Hill Independent, along with several of you. My fun fact is that I'm not actually graduating. I am an imposter here because I'm a .5er, but I finished my thesis this semester. And I'm an INFJ, although actually every time I take the Myers-Briggs, my answer changes because identity is unstable.
You can just keep it. So I'm Ayomide. I tend to go by Ayo. I'm studying anthropology. I'm a GPS facilitator, so GPS is the Gender, Power, and Sexuality workshop. And it's like spiel. A workshop dedicated to exploring sexuality and its intersections with the systems of oppression that exist around us. I eat a lot of Ben & Jerry's. Favorite flavor is Urban Bourbon. You should try it. It's really good. And like you don't need to be 21 to buy it. And I'm also an INFJ, and I've only taken the test once because I feel like it would change if I took it again. And I really like being an INFJ because like it's like advocate, and I'm like that me. So yeah.
I'm going to do an intervention. I saw someone in the audience said, "What's INFJ?" So you have to deconstruct what is Myers-Briggs in the first place.
Ooh, so Myers-Briggs types are like. Anna, you should probably explain this because I feel like you know more about it. So you go ahead.
I don't know anything about this, but so there are essentially 4 categories. The first letter, you can either be an I, an introvert, or an E, an extrovert, and then the letters get messier in my mind from there. I think the next one you can be intuitive or sensing.
I think so.
Sensory. Then the following letter you can be a feeler or a thinker, and then the last letter is you can be a judger or a perceiver. And so essentially, I think they're like that ends up being 16 permutations, and that means 16 different personality types that you can essentially be categorized into. We thought it'd be a fun way to kind of like introduce the idea of identity in our identity-based workshop.
So pretty much I'm like an introvert who is intuitive, feels a lot of things, and is like mildly judgy, but like, don't worry about it.
Yeah. My name is Charlie. I am an ethnic studies and sociology concentrator. I'm also an academic coach within academic support services, in which I pretty much help people with their lives, especially during this tumultuous time of finals and reading period. So if you need any assistance with time management, look us up. I didn't know what kind of fun fact to put, so I just put I love cake and cheesecake, especially like I've been able to get more access to it because on the reservation it's mainly fruits that I eat that are my dessert and some sort of way of like making it sweet. According to the Myers-Briggs, I am an ENFJ.
Hi, I'm Anna. I wish I'd chosen a better photo because I realize now that everyone else had really nice photos, and I went with that. So anyway, that's representative. I'm an anthropology concentrator. I'm a peer advisor at the Curricular Resource Center, and I'm also chair of Shakespeare on the Green, which I'll talk about in my presentation. This is entirely true. I was once attacked by a pelican. You can hear about that later if you want, not during this presentation. And I'm an ENTP.
Hi everyone, my name is May Verano. I study both ethnic studies and public health. I don't do anything on campus this year because I didn't want to. But it's mainly like, instead of being involved and like being a leader, it's my role, or what I wanted to do this year was mainly like attend people's workshops and like be sort of that supporting role from afar, from like my nice off-campus house. My fun fact is that I like both poetry and gossip, which may or may not be the same thing. I'm not really sure. And I am an INFP. The FP is like a really important part to me because I like just like perceiving how people are, but then also like really sitting in my feelings. I don't know, I haven't met a lot of INFPs lately, so that's a thing.
Okay, so
Cool. Okay, I'm going to start. Cool. So I wrote my thesis in English nonfiction, and it's basically a collection of essays orbiting around issues within queer theory, queer activism, and kind of the place of those projects in a political landscape after Trump. And I think probably like a lot of us, that election really like made me question the stakes of my research and my interests. But I'm going to be talking about just one chapter here. And a quick content warning, I'm going to talk really briefly about some transphobic violence and legislation. It won't get graphic or anything, but just a heads up. So my first chapter basically traces three kind of established steps or waves within the relatively short history of queer theory, and that's kind of organized roughly chronologically, and then attempts to sort of put those waves in conversation with each other in a discussion about the intersections of queer theory and memoir, and the ways in which people are borrowing from theoretical frameworks in order to write kind of against academic theory. So the first wave that I kind of looked at was the sort of emergence of queer theory onto the academic scene in the late 80s and early 90s. And that involved a group of scholars taking up the sort of Foucauldian project that kind of takes seriously the idea that fundamentally unstable identity categories like sexuality are importantly made stable and made legible through literary production. So the idea that various genre formations, the emergence of certain character types and so on, don't just correspond with emergent identities, but also in many ways enable those identities and make them visible to the public. So this is kind of like history of sexuality 101. And an example to think about might be the emergence of the archetype of the bachelor in late 19th century fiction by writers like Henry James, pictured here looking really like sultry. And that identity type sort of corresponding with and also enabling this figure of like the unmarried man or maybe the sort of closeted homosexual. But the Foucauldian intervention, taken up again in queer theory, is going to tell us that these identity formations happen kind of in the service of state control. So as soon as identities are legible, they also can be regulated, persecuted, and so on. And so my thesis asks, moving beyond the focus on sexual identity that characterized queer theory of the 80s and 90s, and moving beyond the sort of 19th century literature that body of work tended to focus on, what kinds of identity enablings do we find in contemporary trends in literary production? What newly legible identity categories are being produced and made visible today? And by what kinds of contemporary writing practices and genre formations, both inside and outside the academy? And what does this all have to do with power? So I think the answer kind of lies in the next two waves of queer theory that I'm looking at. And the second wave sort of, some people have called the affective turn. And these are waves that I'm not making up. These, like, people have remarked on this kind of intellectual history. So in response to a number of problems with the sort of like earlier body of queer theoretical work, chief among them the sort of like homogeneity of the people who are practicing queer theory or getting credit for queer theory, which is largely like white cis men. We start to see in the early 2000s this newfound interest within queer scholarship around affect, that is, in the feelings and moods, not always purely theorizable, that attend queer identity. So what emerges is a focus on experiential or even phenomenological understandings of what sexuality feels like in its embodied form. This often takes the shape of a sort of dwelling on like negative affects, like shame, stigma, melancholy, failure, which is really interesting and kind of a bummer. So along with this comes this new sort of theoretical investment in first-person writing. Theorists are starting to write criticism that's infused with memoir. The I voice becomes much more prominent in theory and criticism around the turn of the century. Cool Eve Sedgwick quote to keep in mind. I won't read it. The third sort of not quite concomitant, I think slightly more recent turn or wave within queer theory is this emergence of trans studies, which I think corresponds to a kind of like slow arc toward a kind of intersectional understanding of queerness that we see in theory or in the academy. Slow but not finished. So if queer theory, queer theory of the 80s and 90s sort of prioritized historicizing, theorizing, and destabilizing sexuality specifically. This is a focus that corresponded with a number of social factors and political movements, namely the AIDS crisis pushing a kind of newly imperiled queer identity into the public eye. But as HIV protease inhibitors slowed down the AIDS epidemic in the late 90s, and then as we see this wave of sort of assimilationist like advances like marriage equality and the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, I think, and maybe people disagree, that the political urgency of queerness as such, especially the kind of white cis queerness that's like going to be figured in earlier queer theory, seems to wane a bit as that identity becomes a little bit more legible. So in many ways, but not in total parallel, I'd like to argue that a lot of the public and academic discourse that had once concerned itself with sexuality has turned toward or made space instead for trans issues. So today, a number of social factors, including transphobic legislation, like these really reprehensible bathroom bills, and the possible repeal of the ACA, coupled with really visible acts of violence and a lot of pop culture, have fomented a wave of public interest in trans livelihood, what Time magazine calls the transgender tipping point a couple of years ago. This is all happening sort of in conjunction with an emergent body of theoretical work that's being recognized as trans studies. So in 2014, the scholar Susan Stryker launched the first issue of the Transgender Studies Quarterly, which is the first ever scholarly journal devoted to trans issues through like anything other than a medical lens. Trans studies programs are popping up in like more progressive universities around the country, and I think that Brown is offering its first ever trans studies class in the fall, which is pretty cool. So where trans studies have sort of dovetailed with this movement toward affect and first-person writing is in the recent proliferation of a bunch of memoirs and semi-autobiographical writing about trans life. So my thesis takes as its central object of study this book, The Argonauts by Maggie Nelson, which is a really popular 2015 work of sort of hybrid memoir criticism, or what she calls autotheory. And it's a book about her marriage and pregnancy with a gender-fluid artist. And I could talk about this book all day, so feel free to ask questions. But other really visible and relatively mainstream texts too, like this book In the Dark Room, which came out last year, and which is about the author Susan Faluti's parent coming out as trans, along with some like non-book texts like the TV show Transparent, and a slew of maybe well-intentioned but really problematic memoirs about parents raising trans or gender-creative kids have all offered these first-person accounts of trans life. But most of the best-known examples and best-selling examples of memoir about transness aren't being written about trans people at all, and instead by the parents, spouses, siblings, lovers, and children of trans people. So if we go back for a minute to the sort of directive borrowed from early queer theory that literary production can actually solidify identity categories into legibility or produce identity for the public, as well as the idea that a first-person point of view can offer unique nuance to the writing about identity, then this is really scary, right? That the people who are being given the power to produce a newly legible trans identity from the first person are not themselves trans. And we can see this reflected in a lot of the media that's emerging about trans life, which is, a lot of it's really bad. So many of these projects represent mostly white trans people, star cis actors playing trans roles, or present transitioning as a movement between the sort of fixed points of male and female, instead of representing the infinite and unstable ways in which gender can be lived, felt, and transgressed. So the question becomes, what kinds of texts are being produced and given the capital to be widely distributed and read that offer first-person perspectives on trans life in a way that might enable and make legible positive, reparative, or empowering understandings of gender? And how can we, as readers, but also as publishers, producers, content creators, make space for more of those kinds of texts? So I'm going to end by pointing to a text that I think does this really interestingly. In 2013, an English translation was published of Paul Preciado's book, Testo Junkie, which is a sort of hybrid text that's partially a history of regimes of gender control and partially a kind of diary about Preciado's experiments in self-administering black market testosterone. So the book was initially written in Spanish in 2007, and it actually coins the term autotheory, which is going to be borrowed by Maggie Nelson, to describe writing that takes its author's own body or life as a site for theoretical inquiry in a kind of explosion of academic and personal modes. It's really interesting, really nuanced, and I think we could look to this kind of writing as a model for what we should be making more space for as readers. Thanks.
Perhaps we can take one or two questions before going to the next speaker. Does anyone have a comment or question for Lisa?
Something to think about that I didn't really get into is like kind of the politics of visibility or legibility. And I think that my presentation and a lot of these texts that have emerged places a lot of importance on identity categories becoming visible or becoming legible, but I think it's also really interesting and important to think about the ways in which some communities or individuals might benefit from remaining like unreadable, by the state or by each other.
I guess maybe to that point, what do you think is distinct about auto theory specifically, as opposed to the previous literary production that may be more third-person narrative, in terms of how it relates to that power or ability of the state to regulate those identities that are visible? Is it what is that first-person narrative doing?
Totally. I mean, I think that it's interesting to think about theory itself as a sort of dominant ideology or as a mode of writing or communication that demands a kind of intervention. And I think that theory for a long time didn't really make space for people whose gender identities or sexual identities aren't totally theorizable. So I think that the ability to intervene in that sort of discursive mode with the first person is really important, and I think that's why texts like this seem to have so much power. But that is a huge question that my thesis only can ever approach.
There's a question in the corner.
I have sort of a comment. I don't think Bradley Manning is an appropriate example of the trans movement. I think
Chelsea Manning?
well, his original name was Bradley Manning, and now you're saying Chelsea, but isn't that, it seems more an example of duress and punishment and abuse than anything certainly voluntary. And I get into this with all my friends too. I mean, just this one example. I think Manning is meant to be a real example of what happens to people who dump millions of government files.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, yeah. I don't really talk very much about Chelsea Manning in my thesis, but I do think that she's an interesting example of a very visible public figure. I don't know. I think the only time she surfaced was on the cover of Trans Studies Quarterly, which I think does speak to the sort of academic and public interest in her, both as a whistleblower and as a trans public figure.
And also, just sort of, if I may, with that point as well, I think that a lot of the times when people talk about Chelsea Manning, it's very in context of, especially her identity as a trans woman. It's always in the context of whether they agree or disagree with what she did as a whistleblower. But I think that there needs to be a separation between her identity as a trans woman and her actions as a whistleblower, however people want to view them. And so like, while we could sort of talk about what she did in exposing, like, releasing, like, a bunch of government files, I don't think that it's necessarily relevant to her identity as a trans woman. And, like, I've heard a lot of people say that, like, now she wants to say that she's trans because she's in prison, and it's just, like, a ploy for attention. But I feel like it's very easy, and everybody has always found, like, reasons to discount trans identities. And I don't think that it's something we should necessarily do for Chelsea Manning.
Totally. Yeah, and she's on the slide here with Caitlyn Jenner, too. And obviously Caitlyn Jenner is, like, incredibly problematic, like, voted for Donald Trump. But, it's, like, the saying, call her out, but call her Caitlyn. You can, like, disagree with somebody but still respect their identity.
So we'll have time for more questions for Lisa, but why don't we move on to Ayo?
Yeah, of course. So this semester, I decided to take an independent study course in which I wrote the script for a graphic novel, with the main character being the Yoruba goddess Oshun, who is also represented in Santeria and a lot of other religions that are offshoots of the Yoruba Ifa religion. Also, a quick shout out to my friend Alexis, who let me borrow her name for my graphic novel. But so pretty much the general synopsis of the novel is that Oshun is reimagined as a black woman in the United States named Alexis, and she has to sort of fight through all these, like, her family, biological and non-biological, has been touched by, like, racism and police brutality, in that she has lost too many parents and too many family members to police brutality. And so she's fighting against this repressive, like, regime, like, led by the triad being sort of like the villains in the story of, like, a white supremacist institution that is dedicated to mass incarceration and mass murder of black and brown bodies, which, like, writing this, I was like, I'm writing fiction, and then I'd, like, see something on the news, I'm like, I'm not writing fiction. But, like, so the important characters in this story are Oshun, so she's also called Alexis, her non-biological sister, Jamila. So I'm going to talk more about this, but it goes into, like, chosen families and things like that. And Jamila's biological mother, who is also, like, Oshun's adopted mother, Angela, and Oshun's biological mother, Yemoja, who is also a Yoruba goddess in the pantheon. So I'm actually just going to talk about them really quickly. Who is Oshun? Beyoncé is not Oshun. I just put that there because she's been invoking her a lot in the way that she dresses. I don't know if y'all saw the, like, maternity like photo shoot, and it was just so, like, wonderful. And so she's just been sort of, like, portraying this. But on the left is a shrine to the goddess herself, and she's a deity in the Ifa religion as well as a couple of others. And she is the goddess of beauty, of love, of fertility, of womanhood, femininity, and of rivers. And she's, like, I just, like, have always been sort of drawn to her since I started, like, looking into, like, the Orishas, because she's like a very powerful goddess who sort of is always underestimated and always undervalued in terms of her power, and people always think that she can't do things, but then she's also, like, one of the most powerful people without, like, letting go of any parts of her personality that people read as weak. And sort of thinking about her in this way made me think very much about, like, being a black woman and how that's, like, a lot of what I perceive black womanhood to be, of, like, constantly being undervalued and underappreciated, but still sort of, like, rising to the top and always, like, being, like, as best as we can be. And so she's also, like, a protector of women, a protector of children, and, like, mother of all orphans. And Beyoncé channeling Oshun, especially with, like, the Lemonade album of her, like, fighting to sort of be appreciated by, like, the people that she thinks should appreciate her, and, like, not getting that, and sort of, like, channeling Oshun really, like, spelled that out for me. And so this is a quote that's actually in Beyonce's book, but is also, like, from a Yoruba, like, priest. She's been a victim of abuse, neglect, and loss, which is the reason so many women who have experienced these actions worship her. When she seeks revenge out for those who have hurt her and her children, she is unpredictable in her methods and temper. She can show herself laughing, dancing, and joyous, all while unleashing a wrath on those who cross her. And, like, it just seemed very, like, spirit of, like, black womanhood to me. Like, I don't know if it's just me, but I've talked to a bunch of other, like, black women too, and it's just, like, sort of being black in America is very much, like, being a black woman in America is being at the intersection of racism and sexism all the time. And, like, my character is actually a queer black woman, so she's, like, at more intersections. but she still sort of finds this way to sort of thrive and to like live and be happy and joyous. And so I like thought about her as representative of Black women, and in the story specifically, she loses a lot of she loses her parents, she loses a lot of people. I'm trying to figure out how much to tell you without like spoiling the whole story. But she like comes back stronger, and I wanted to create Oshun, the character, as like this supernatural person in a regular world. So she's the only one with like these like water powers and like controlling the river. And it just felt very symbolic to me to sort of give this Black woman, like, in this world, like, there's got to be something about you that they can't even take away from you. It's innate, it's a power. And so that I was able to sort of do that through like writing Oshun as that. And also I wanted to like, I really appreciated the water metaphor, because like water, I think in the past of like Black life in America has been really interesting, with like water being like the medium through which like slave ships like traveled, and like all the politics around like Black people and like swimming, and like just the whole method of it. And so water being like a destructive and a source of pain, but also being like a source of restoration, and just sort of like owning it. Like, I don't know if y'all saw like Simone Manuel like win that race during the Olympics, but I was cheering like in my living room, because that just felt really like symbolic to me of like we're winning through like the things that were previously like our pain, and sort of like rephrasing it and remaking it into something that's joyous. So my next slide has a comment from Chimamanda Adichie, and I just wanted to point out, because I like wanted to acknowledge like her transphobic statements and like just sort of like have that out there. So it does, like, I don't want to sort of excuse that, but I also found this quote to be very like relevant, because she's talking about the danger of the single story, and how when she was writing as a child, all her characters were white and blue-eyed and played in snow, despite the fact that like she lived in Nigeria, was dark skinned, had brown eyes, and had never seen snow ever. And like it just really resonated with me, because like when I was a child writing, all my characters were white and blue-eyed as well. And so like writing like representation is resistance, and like Lisa was sort of talking about like validating and legitimizing identities through like literature, was something that I thought about a lot, because when like representation is like super important, because it shows the complexity of like humans, and it like whether in like media or like in writing, it just like being able to see someone who looks like me doing things that I like might have thought I was not able to do is really powerful, and it's sort of a source of resistance. And like especially after the election, I was sort of just like, I don't know what to do, and feeling like hopeless, but being able to like reclaim power through writing and through literature. And so I also wanted to like make a lot of the topics in the graphic novel are things that like are being talked about, and so I wanted to make Black Lives Matter in this book, because I felt like there was a lot of politics about whether Black lives should matter in the real world, but in this book I was able to control that and give Black lives meaning. And like I don't even need to give Black lives meaning, they have meaning, but to acknowledge the meaning of Black lives and the like worth of Black like humanity. And so like this just sort of like putting the real world in the book, and there are actually like quotes in the book where like they're talking about like whether like Black lives matter and like fighting for that. So I wanted to sort of like make a fiction book, but also like acknowledge the world in which we live in, and like create this reality, but also with pieces of the reality in which like we actually exist. And so just like wanting to really validate like Black lives and Black womanhood and Black anger and Black pain, and like being able to feel things without sort of being like the angry Black woman like stereotype, which by the way is like my aesthetic. So yeah. And so for this slide, I was thinking about like Jamila being like Alexis's like non-biological sister, and just sort of representing Black sisterhood to me, because a lot of like the time I'm thinking about how a lot of the support the Black women have is from other Black women, and especially like them being like queer Black women, and having like a chosen family of people who support them, and also being Black women. And like personally, I adore POC sisterhood. Like I love my Black women, I love my like women of color friends. Like it's just like my greatest source of support and strength is through that, especially like chosen family, and just being like wanting to really represent that in the book. So with like Jamila and Alexis's relationship of like they're not sisters like by blood, but like they're sisters where it matters, and just sort of like tying it back to representation. I just sort of like picked a bunch of like random but like pretty popular stories. So like there's like the X-Men Storm, which like I think like is really popular because everybody sort of like knows about Storm even if they never followed her. That's Amanda Waller. If you saw Suicide Squad, she was played by the wonderful Viola Davis, who I actually forgot her name. Oh, it's Misty something. I'm sorry. I didn't grow up on comic books. And then Halle Berry's Catwoman, and this is Ayo and Anika. So she actually has my name. They're from the Black Panther books, and they're queer Black women, and it's like wonderful, and they're just so powerful. And I just really wanted to sort of end on that slide. But yeah, that's all from me.
Do we have 1 or 2 questions for Ayo? Yes.
Yeah, so I just wanted to raise the point that in mainstream America, and like particularly with the white gaze, like a spectacle is made of Black suffering, and often there's like profit related to it, like whether it's the prison industrial complex or like just the portrayals of Black poverty in the media. And I was just wondering how you dealt with that in your book in light of like all of the violence and struggle that each character has to deal with.
Yeah, so I actually like thought about that a lot and worked with my like faculty supervisor about like how to portray Black death in this, because I get tired of like what I call like tragedy porn every time there's like another like police shooting and it's like 24/7 news media playing the video over and over again. So I think that something I did was actually after like the beginning, there's not a lot of Black death, and there's certainly not like graphic like Black death, and a lot of what I actually show from like what Alexis and Jamila go through is like their interactions with each other and sort of like talking about their pain and feeling it and being there for each other. So there's not sort of like a lingering like sit here and wallow in this pain, although like they would definitely have the right to, but I wanted to sort of frame the narrative to be they're always in the like position of power, even when they're sort of like down. Like it's still theirs to reclaim when they want to. And so like just focusing more on the power and focusing more on the like humanity of them rather than showing like what happens to them, so like showing them and what they do and how they feel rather than what people are doing to them or what's being done to them. And I like hope that I sort of did that right, but like I'm gonna have a bunch of people read through like the graphic novels before like anything really happens, and like I'm totally down to edit things. Yeah.
How did we find a copy of your
Well, my favorite question. I currently have the script written. I'm still trying to find an illustrator. But I do like totally have a bunch of edits to do, so if you like wanted to like read it and like let me know what you think, I'm about to hit you up.
And will you be doing a reading or?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I'm totally A-okay with doing a reading. I will be here. We can plan this later.
We'll talk about that.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, time for more questions for you later, but now we'll have Charlie.
Hi, everyone. So before I begin, I wanted to recognize the Indigenous caretakers of this land and whose stories exist alongside the formation and interaction with the land, so those who are of Wampanoag and Narragansett descent and their ancestors. So my project is titled Experiential Aesthetics, Storytelling, and Photography. It was originally presented in sociology yesterday, and it was a collaborative project between myself and the people who could participate. So what we created together is actually going to be a chapbook that showcased a unique theme that emphasized each of their aesthetics, as Ayo has mentioned earlier. They were given the freedom to control their own imagery and to tell their own story, contributing to what I have called the sentient archive, and subsequently becoming their own representation of knowledges. Together, we had conversations trying to comprehend who they are. natural freedom for Raven Carson. So I can start off by saying that I hate these questions. Mostly because it's like a sad way I feel like I haven't had a lot of space in my life to decide who I am. How they identify, eternal flow, Haley de Rosa. I am a human entity that grew up on a geographical space labeled as the border region of South Texas in the Rio Grande Valley in Edinburgh, Texas. How would they describe their aesthetic? Mass, Alexander Scrivando. I come in mass and veil so thick, no life can travel past. And I believe to come from war, so many closets, mazes, plain statue for you. I cloak myself, the mask falls down. Miss Imbriglio, I undress myself, a butterfly mask. And we had these conversations in an effort for them to get thinking about how they want to be photographed and what we could envision together. From Stephen Luthold, I use the term aesthetic to refer to the real aspects of lived experiences that have a social dimension. The experiential aesthetic is bodily and or sensory, meaning that it's not only abstract and theoretical, but it's real and material. Andromedon, Sarah Shu. After I realized it was sort of like my grandma's aesthetic, just like things I never thought I would like to wear, that was kind of like empowering. A lot of the time, images and photographs are often situated within an existing structure of understanding our ways of being. The earliest known photograph was taken by Nicéphore Niépce in 1826. And since then, photography has evolved to the point of digital technology and immediate printing, continuing to fascinate people and contribute to a much wider narrative of understanding people. Photography then became a means of institutionalizing frameworks of understanding both of its creators and those who wish to understand the other. The understanding of personhood differentiate between the colonizer and the colonized. As more and more communities of people became disrupted and displaced, photography produced and consumed those same communities within European American understandings. A lot of ways, these photographs was something that I was trying to work against, trying to decolonize photography and using it as ways of empowerment, reimagining beauty, and providing people an avenue to understand their own aesthetics. So I'm trying to sort of like what Ayu is doing is something that's trying to find something that's innate within us and show and present that to the world, especially among those within the photographs. Linda Smith in Decolonizing Methodologies describes decolonization as a process of reclaiming and recentering both concerns and worldviews. It is understanding knowledge, theory, and research from our own perspectives and for our own purposes. Decolonizing photography was no easy task. Many of the people in my project had difficulty taking ownership of the camera. They would ask for me for directions and cues, and I would shrug and say, "You're the one in charge. All I am here is to follow your directions and to ask when to take photos." The type of methodology that I employed for this project I called collaborative narrative building. Within the academy, people might suggest it's narrative inquiry. By that, I mean like humans are storytelling organisms. The study of narrative, therefore, is the study of ways that humans experience the world. From an indigenous lens, this is storytelling. When people share their stories, they're sharing from their own archive of knowledge, what they experience and what they have come to understand the world and themselves, which vary greatly and is very deeply personal. Storytelling becomes a means of knowing and transferring understandings of knowledge, culture, and power. It is a collaboration, if you will, that builds a relationship. One thing that I've learned when I was writing my thesis, which is in another concentration, was that, oh wait, I missed an entire part. Oh well, it's okay. We can go, whoa, never mind. Anyway, going back to listening, my apologies. An elder told Joanne Archibald, who is an indigenous person in the Stolo and community, is that it's important to listen with 3 ears, 2 on the side and 1 in your heart. This relationship between the listener and the storyteller reconsiders what stories and photographs can be. theorizing and presenting one's own aesthetic brings to what I have named as the sentient archive, which I didn't know showed up. So what I mean by this is that personal stories become their own living entities. Images contribute to that stories. They mingle together in a relationship that allows the archive to become a living entity, that one can interact with it and experience this archive in ways that folks who are trying to access personal narratives and a collective of ancestral memories, they're all there. They exist, and they're waiting. And then those stories, as they develop and as they grow more and more refined, they become more interactive. People start accessing deeper things that are there. Stories then begin to act as a catalyst for providing detailed descriptions with information on motivations and decision-making processes, as well as understanding us. Hope and inner movement, Brian Elizalde. I feel you are also what you enjoy doing. I enjoy writing. I would then identify as a writer and as a person with a lot of hope. There's the other one about Joanne Archibald. It's okay. Yeah, thank you. Are there any questions?
For Charlie.
Did you coin the term sentient archive?
I did. It actually came up in a conversation in ethnic studies that I had alongside with two other folks that I can't remember, but I do remember that Phoebe Young was there and Sam Somer, correct? And there was one more person. Yes. Maybe even. But there was like four of us all together, and we were talking. We were trying to figure out our understandings of histories of violence and our understandings of like histories and legacies of resilience, and the meant of like stories and like how we can make the archive more alive. So then I was like, then if and thinking about like stories and storytelling, and thinking about indigenous storytelling and how creation stories become an outline of building relationships and an outline of like communicating knowledges and beliefs, the archive becomes more sapient. Knowledge becomes more sapient, is with that aspect, and that we begin to realize that like what we're interacting with has been sort of like created and made from other people. So that's why I've coined a term, sentient archive.
Yeah, I guess a lot of what I've thought about is like the potential violence in photography happens at like its reproduction and its dissemination, and I'm wondering how you've thought through what like distribution or like duplication looks like in this form of storytelling.
In terms of like,
just in terms of like in the ways that you're negotiating what a more like self-reflective or more empowering like way of archiving is. Like I'm wondering how you are thinking through the ways that that can be shared or like delivered to other audiences in ways that isn't like that aren't violent or like aren't damaging to the people who are like being reflected in those images.
a lot of like what I do is try to sort of like do multimedia communications, because there's always a limit to how we communicate things, whether it be through writing and how we do photography. So like when you look at these images by themselves, all you just see is hands. There's a story behind that. You see eyes, you see I can't remember what that is, an earring, and you see a butterfly earring, and you see a person, and you see this person. Like, they're beautiful by themselves, but they become silent because there's no way of like, there's no, what you can say is textual language attached to it. And so what I try to do is like, try to figure out like how I can attach text to these images and how I can sort of like evoke those same feelings. But it's not a perfect way of communicating because there's still a lot missing here. Like, for example, Brian's voice is missing, like how he identified to myself, how he answered that question of who I am. It's lost, and I've been trying to figure a way to do that. But what I have found out is that by communicating as much as we can through both text and through images, there becomes like a sense of like vulnerability that's still there. But again, it's not perfect. I don't think it'll ever be perfect. And people might say that like video might be the thing, but like it's not pretty, in my opinion. Yes.
Yeah, I want to offer a comment in response to that. As a participant in the project, I felt like what Charlie did really well was allowing the person to, who said the question? Okay, allowed the person to decide what images they wanted to be reflected in the final project, the final product, and disseminated, as you said. So that sort of gave control back to the person. I know we see that with journalism a lot, is people will go out to foreign countries and take photos of communities, take them and decide which ones to present, just form that narrative for them, and that's where I think a lot of the harm exists. And the other thing I want to say about Charlie's project is I found it to be so powerful, because I think it was the first time in my life anyone's ever asked me to tell my story, and not in a story that's rooted in the historical context of oppression and slavery and Black history that's not particularly my own personal narrative. And so that was really, I think, like the highlight as a participant, but also watching you talk about this idea of decolonization, is that people have individual stories that aren't necessarily rooted in a broader history, and that those are important to tell as well. I really appreciate that.
Thank you. Yeah, it was really fun with Raven. They were really hesitant. They were one of the people who were like, I don't know what to do.
Awesome. Thank you. Anna.
Thanks for going back, Charlie. You remember this stuff, right? We just did this. Perfect. Thank you so much. Hi, so my project will be on, it's called Beyond Colorblind Casting, Inclusivity and Accessibility in Shakespearean Theater. In particular, I'm talking about my work through Shakespeare on the Green, which is an on-campus student production group. And we produce site-specific Shakespeare and Shakespeare-related works. So site-specific meaning we don't perform in theaters, we perform outdoors and on various like non-theater venues on campus. For example, last year we did a performance that was entirely in the bottom 2 floors of Sales, and each scene was a different location that you could go to. So that's one example of site specificity. Another is earlier this year we did a production of Hamlet in the courtyard behind Metcalf. So those are 2 different types of site specificity. And by Shakespeare and Shakespeare-related works, I mean obviously Shakespeare's Canon, but also works that could be considered related, such as Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, which is a modern play but involves Shakespearean characters, or works that have similar resonances and themes. I've been on the board for the last 4 years. I'm a senior, and I've been chair of the board for the last 2 years. So that's the man himself. That is Shakespeare, or what people think he might have looked like. And sometimes he has like an earring or something to make him a little hip or something, but not in this particular etching or carving. So as you can see, Shakespeare was a white man. When I first joined the board of Shakespeare on the Green, there were extremely few actors of color in our productions. I was the only person of color on the board. And performances and events were physically inaccessible. They were often held in, like events were held in Wilson, like the outdoor performances, you weren't able to get there if you had any sort of movement or mobility impairment. So site specificity became a huge issue in terms of who our audiences were. There's also, as I will mention later, a huge amount of inaccessibility when it comes to like the language of Shakespeare itself. In short, our plays here looked a lot like Shakespearean plays have looked for the last several hundred years. Very white, a lot of men. The women all were very submissive. And I was excited when I became chair to try and do something different. Colorblind casting is a term that's been tossed around a lot recently. I'm sure you've at least heard of it. I've defined it loosely as considering actors for roles regardless of their perceived race or ethnicity. I find this to be a useful but slightly problematic framework in that when we think of Shakespearean characters, besides probably Othello, we think automatically of white characters. So even if you go into casting as a director with the intention of performing colorblind casting, the preconceived notions of what these characters look like will continue to perpetuate these characters as white characters necessarily, or cis characters, or het characters, etc. So when I became chair, I identified 5 major problems in Shakespeare's canon and the way that it's like worked with and perceived that I felt we had to address in order to start to tell different stories in the works. So here they are. I will read them in order. Nearly all the roles in Shakespeare's canon were written for white, cis, able-bodied actors, all of whom were men. While Shakespeare was almost certainly queer, and if you don't believe me, read some of his steamier sonnets to a young man. There's quite some content in there, but even though Shakespeare was almost certainly queer, in the years since his original performances, his queer characters have been written as just like buddies. So that's something that we were taking into consideration. Second point is that many of the plays and the sonnets touch on difficult and triggering topics such as suicide and abuse, which prevents certain actors from being able to access the works and prevent certain audience members from being able to access the plays. Characters that present madness, such as Lady Macbeth, Hamlet, and Poor Tom, who's a character from King Lear, create the potential for misrepresentation of mental illness on stage. It's very easy to just play a general and uninformed madness that really doesn't mean anything, and it doesn't actually present what real mental illness looks like. Generally, teaching of Shakespeare is limited to schools in white upper-class areas, and classical acting training is also limited to the same populations. So the actors that we were getting to come see our shows were pretty much of the same background, and so were the actors who were coming to audition for the shows. And as I mentioned, site-specific theater can be extremely physically inaccessible for both actors and audiences, especially when outdoors. So we were considering sort of the same question that Lisa brought up in their presentation. How can we make space? And to that end, how can we tell different stories by including different people? So when we expand the scope of Shakespearean roles, we get to tell new and different and nuanced and modernized and empowering stories, right? And so Ayo was talking about the danger of the single story. So my goal through this particular intervention was to be able to tell specific and new stories through Shakespeare's existing works. A dramaturg is an individual responsible for providing historical, cultural, and textual background for a play's actors, directors, and designers. For example, a production I was in earlier this year in the Heights takes place in El Barrio in New York. So our dramaturg would come in and tell us will tell designers what sort of signs you would find in the area, or if you would find what kind of taxi you would find in the area, what sort of phone numbers, what the zip code was, that specific kind of thing, so that the designers could make the set that fit the location. The dramaturg would also tell actors how to pronounce certain words that they might not know how to say, and they would let us know about the time period and the location of the play. So it's a pretty common role in a production, especially of Shakespeare, because there's a lot of terminology that people aren't familiar with, and the context is often very specific. So in imagining how we might be able to move beyond those 5 problems that I identified in the earlier slide, we created a role called diversiturg, which is not a transformer. It's a conglomeration of the word diversity and dramaturg. So we chose 2 diversiturgs for our board that first year, which was last year. And since then, we've kept 2 diversiturgs on our board every semester. The role of the diversiturg starts from the proposal of a show to our board. So when we choose shows, we have directors who are interested write proposals about what the show might be and how they would be as a director, their vision for the show, and also it includes their team. So a diversiturg would start working with a director at the level of the proposal, talking through issues of casting, representation, vision, what it might mean to cast people of different identities in certain roles. For example, Romeo and Juliet becomes a very different story if, let's say, Romeo is black. If Romeo goes into a courtyard that belongs to another white family in the middle of the night, he's not supposed to be there, this is a rival family, it is dead of night, and he sneaks in to see this girl. It is a very different thing when Juliet says, if they see thee, they will murder thee, if Romeo is black. It just means a different thing, it's a different story. And it allows us to explore the works in different ways. So after the proposal stage, and also during the proposals, the directors are supposed to come up with the venues that they might perform in. So we recently decided that in order to ensure that our performances are physically accessible to audience members, we would have at least one performance that is always indoors in a physically accessible location. Even if other performances are outdoors, like that ensures that people who have to be indoors for performance can also see the show. So in deciding venues, Diversaturgs also help facilitate those conversations about where on campus is inaccessible or accessible. Casting, I think, is one of the most interesting parts for a Diversaturg, because they will remind the directors and the other people casting about other ways in which the stories can be told through different roles and different bodies. For example, Diversaturg might suggest, like, I know that this role was written for a man. What do you think of this genderqueer actor who did a fantastic job in the audition? I think they would tell the story really well. And it would be up to the director to say, like, you know what, I hadn't thought about that. You're right, thank you for letting me know. And like that person would therefore be able to be considered, whereas they normally wouldn't be. Then through rehearsal, Diversaturgs stay in contact with the cast and the directors and the crew to make sure that they're available as a resource. They give a presentation at least once during the rehearsal process about topics that are relevant to the play. So recently we did a performance of The Art of Dining, which is a modern play by Tina Howe that touches on a lot of topics related to eating disorders. So the Diversaturgs came in and gave presentations on portrayals of eating disorders in other plays and how they have or haven't contributed to perceptions in like the public of eating disorders. They gave resources to the actors to make sure they felt safe during the process portraying characters with eating disorders, and also being around food in that way and being able to talk about these topics in a safe way. They gave resources for the director to be able to connect their actors to other resources on campus. So it's a way for the actors to get more information on how to portray things like mental illness in an accurate, faithful, non-stereotyped, but informed way. And lastly, the Diversaturgs carry through to the performance, where they're responsible for making sure the language on our publicity materials are accurately reflect like the material of the show, but also include things like content warnings and trigger warnings that would help audiences decide whether or not they're interested in seeing the show, but also whether the show is something that they are able to see or not. So on the left, that's a very famous painting of Ophelia from Hamlet. She's always painted as white, blonde, she's always dressed in white, very frail and very fragile. And on the right is a photo of me looking kind of like an eagle in this fall's production of Hamlet, playing Ophelia. And as I said before, it means something different to see different bodies in different roles. So I was really worried, firstly, about being an Asian woman playing a really submissive character, because that's a stereotype that gets played out a lot, is this like lotus woman stereotype of a very submissive, quiet woman in the face of like a more powerful man. It's like a particularly strong Asian stereotype. So I was really worried about falling into that, especially because that's not a story I was interested in telling. I don't think that that narrative belongs in my life, and I didn't want to tell that story that way. It didn't feel real or natural to me. Secondly, Ophelia has a very famous like madness scene in which she, after the loss of her brother and her father, and also she's like becoming distant from her boyfriend Hamlet, she goes mad and starts like distributing these flowers. It's a pretty famous scene, but it's also used really commonly as a way to describe like female vulnerability and like hysteria in classical works. So I was worried about those two things, and I worked with the Diversaturgs closely to make sure that my portrayal of Ophelia's madness was informed. I decided to play it as like really extreme grief, because that's a real thing, and it's grounded and it's specific. I also, because I was unable to find any sort of like fragility like that in me, I decided to like that. I decided to give her agency. I decided to give her power in her decisions. She wasn't swayed by men in the way that Ophelia typically is played. I decided to play her as calculated and making these decisions because of the people she cared about. So I think that this kind of intervention allows for different retellings of stories, and also it means something different to be able to see yourself represented on stage. Actors came up to me after this performance and said, like, I'm going to audition for Shakespeare shows now. It's really cool to be able to see people that look like me on stage, like in these roles. The next couple of slides are similar roles that have been reinterpreted by our productions recently. This is my friend Erin playing Gertrude, who's Hamlet's mother, in Hamlet. On the right, we have a Royal Shakespeare production photo of Gertrude. I just think these are complete opposites, and I think that's really wonderful. Here on the left, we have, she was here last year, but she no longer goes here. She was an exchange student. And she played Mercutio from Romeo and Juliet. Mercutio is Romeo's best friend. He's really like quick-witted, and he's a sword fighter. In the middle, there's a classical painting of Mercutio in like quite an outfit. And on the right, that's from the film that you probably saw in high school, Romeo and Juliet. And he just looks like, well, you know what he looks like. And I just think it's a totally different interpretation to see a woman of color in a dress fighting with a sword. It's being the best friend of like Romeo, this totally love-struck guy. It's a different story. On the left is current student Christina Belyakova playing Lear. We decided to forego the king in this location. In the middle is another Royal Shakespeare Company photo of a recent production of King Lear. And on the far right, this is a promotional photo from a production of King Lear that's going to be happening in Providence over the summer. And I don't mean to suggest that like in every case reclaiming a role means to cast a woman in the role of a man. But this was a particularly interesting opportunity, I think, in that Lear has a very special and studied relationship with his daughters, and that's what the play centers on. So a father-daughter relationship in which a father disowns his daughter is a different story than a daughter-mother relationship in which the mother disowns the daughter. Her interpretation became one more about like love and care rather than about coldness and hatred. On the left, this is another current student, Noelle Austin, playing Cordelia in King Lear. On the right, you see a production also from, I think that's the Globe, and in the middle is a classic painting. I think these are complete opposites, and I love that so much. She was a fighter in our production. She was black in our production. She had agency and was able to, like, you know, fight for her husband and for her sisters and for her family, and it was really empowering to watch. This is a poster from an event we did last year called Shakespeare. It was in conjunction with the LGBTQ Center, and it was also in conjunction with Pride Month. There are no production photos because we wanted to be able to protect the identities of the individuals who were in the shows, many of whom who weren't out at home or on Facebook. But in this event, we staged scenes that are already queered in Shakespeare's works. It was no like Romeo and Julio situation where we like gender bent roles. It was like there are already many queer scenes in Shakespeare, and so it was a wonderful festival in which we were able to celebrate the works that are already present in the canon. And these are two photos from our recent events, the 24-hour plays, which we put up in order to make sure that new actors could access our work and our resources and our space as well. Ayo was actually in the more recent one, and it was so much fun to see her. That was her first ever like acting debut. So the majority of the actors in the 24-hour plays were new actors and freshmen. We'd heard a lot about actors having trouble finding space in the acting community, who hadn't had experience before, who were freshmen, who came from low-income backgrounds. And I definitely experienced that when I first came to Brown, where I was like, I don't really know how to do this. I'm not trained. I just don't feel like there are roles for me. And the 24-hour play festival was all new plays that were written the night that the festival began, and they were written specifically for the actors that were cast. Mm-hmm. It is so rare to have a role that is written for you in particular. So these actors had the immense privilege of being able to play roles that were written for them, which means that the playwrights could tailor dialogue to them if they said, I'm not really comfortable memorizing large amounts of text. If they said, I really want to play a queer person on stage, like this is an identity I want to celebrate, then the writers could write that in. And it was a really wonderful opportunity, I think, for actors to be able to engage with their identities in a new and fresh way. And this is our board. It's part of it anyway, after we defeated a bunch of middle schoolers at laser tag, which is something that we're very proud of course. And as I'll be graduating this May, it is May, this month, I'm really excited to see what they go on and do next year. I'm so confident that they'll keep up the work that we began, and of course there's a lot of things that we haven't been able to fix yet, and I'm so excited to see the ways in which they do. Thank you.
Any questions for Anna?
Yeah, what kind of challenges did you face in the theater community when you're trying to bring forth these ideas? Or was it like really close to breaks down?
Sure. Initially, some directors were really resistant to the idea of having someone tell them how to cast their show, which is, of course, not quite what we were doing. We were hoping to offer suggestions as to expand the scope of what people consider to be these roles, but a lot of directors were a little resistant to that at first. They were like, I know what I want, and like I have a vision for my show, but unfortunately, those visions are often very traditionally and very white. So there was some resistance there initially, but since then, it's really caught on. The theater department has met with me a couple times to ask like how they could implement a similar position. So I'm excited to see ways in which this might continue to other boards. Yeah. Sorry, did you have a question as well?
Yeah, I was curious if you looked at all about at other projects in other places trying to do this work with Shakespeare specifically, and sort of what else you saw that was really interesting, or what else you saw that was like not interesting that you to say not to incorporate.
Sure. Something that a lot of Shakespeare groups have been doing recently is designating certain roles for actors of color and being very particular about that, which I think is a really good way of doing that. You can't really do that, I think, in an academic setting, and there are a lot of papers as to how that's difficult, because like there's a limited number of people who are involved in theater on campus, and there are a limited number of people who can be involved in a particular production at any given time. So I feel like that kind of work is less possible in an academic setting, but it's definitely, I think, a good idea, because that way you're intentionally creating space rather than saying like anybody can play this role, but then like the same people keep auditioning for the same roles. I think a downside to the ways that in which people are doing it like out in the world are I'm starting to see this a lot as I've been like starting to audition and apply for things, is because there are particular roles set aside for actors of color, it means that like every other role is defaulted to as white, and also typically men. So I've applied to things and heard back like, sorry, we're actually not looking for like non-white women for this role. It's like, you could, you certainly could. There's no reason why this person has to be a white man. But so that's definitely a difficulty that's out there. Another thing is that because everyone on campus is trying to increase their inclusivity and accessibility and representation in their shows, and because there's a limited acting pool, that means that there's always one show in circulation that is like mostly actors of color, and always one show in circulation that is almost all white actors, and so it just keeps happening. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but it does mean that the show that's all white actors gets really chastised for it, and the show that's all actors of color gets really praised for that. And it really has to do with interest and availability more than anything else. But there are more actors of colors now than there were when I was a freshman, for sure. For sure there are.
So last but not least, May, but I'm going to encourage everyone to do a stretch break. Okay,
Yes.
because we've been sitting for a while, so let's stretch. Panelists as well.
Cool. Can people hear me? Yeah? Sounds okay. Cool. So, in many of the Filipino American spaces that I've been in, there's been this particular obsession with trying to understand what it means to be like a real Filipino. A lot of this is it's like my thesis, but it's also my first person like experience in life and existential crisis consistently. In a lot of these spaces, there's this attempt to build a relationship with the Philippines from abroad through the interrogation of culture and colonization. My honors thesis, titled Performing a Nation, Diasporic Nationalism Through Traditional Filipino Folk Dancing, looks at how this obsession with Filipino identity can be seen in my own life and my experiences with Filipino folk dancing. So Filipino folk dancing, as I know them, I don't know if people in this room know them, but as they're known today, are dances about life in the Philippines. Adapted from real people and communities in the Philippines, they tell the stories of the working class, the educated elite, the indigenous peoples of the Luzon highlands, and the Muslim royalty in the southern islands of Mindanao. But their dramatization and division into different suites have transformed these dances into an ahistorical representation of Filipino culture, separating these different groups of people from one another and portraying the Philippines as this sort of cordial, multicultural country, sort of devoid of any issues, but also has all of these different communities coexisting like peacefully with one another. And as this repertoire goes on to be replicated and choreographed by Filipino communities across the globe, this sort of ahistorical representation just carries on and really affects how Filipino Americans like myself understand the Philippines today. So this is a picture of me and my cousins and my sister. The there's a statue in the back, which is actually like a replication of the Christ child, which is really important to the story I'll tell later. But from the very beginning of my upbringing in the Catholic Church to my time as a Filipino American college student on the East Coast, these dances have played a huge role in my own understanding of my Filipino American identity. These dances have taught me stories of past Filipinos and have given me something to cling on to when trying to understand my distant relationship. But as I've gotten older, I've come to understand, to challenge these ahistorical natures as a way of attempting a clear understanding of what it means to be this true Filipino. This challenge set me to look at my own experiences and question, how does my identity and relationship to the Philippines change and grow as I learn about the creation of Filipino folk dancing? Because I was not learning about these dances for the first time in this research, but rather revisiting them with a new analytic lens, I structured my thesis as this process of unlearning. I reflected on my own experiences and coupled them with close readings of two integral texts about the formation of Filipino folk dancing, closely analyzing how Filipino folk dancing has facilitated Philippine nationalism within myself as a Filipino American. So at the center of my research are these moments of conflict and confusion and hurt that I experienced while learning about these dances. So these dances were a part of the Sinulog festival that I performed in, I want to say like a good 5-7 years, growing up in the Catholic Church. And the thing about these dances, when I was revisiting them in my thesis, is that for me, this dance specifically was a really wonderful time to learn about my community, to learn about my identity. It was a chance for me to dress up in church and perform for my community, and also alongside the rest of my family. This was a way for us to learn about what it meant to be Filipino. But through my thesis, I realized, what is the story behind this dance? And I realized that this dance is actually meant to celebrate Magellan bringing the Christ child to the Philippines and giving this statue to the Muslim royalty in the southern islands of Mindanao. And so just sit with that for a moment. What does it mean? I love that question. What does it mean when, as a child, my understanding of Philippine identity is also grounded in the conversion to Catholicism of Filipinos, by a very violent nature and a very violent history. And that was something that I really had to sit with, both me looking at these pictures, but also calling my sister at 2 a.m. being did you realize this? And she's just oh my gosh, no. So for example, in that picture on the left, I think I'm the child in the red. It's the way the dance went was that these two children are dancing and they're playing, and then all of a sudden they fall asleep, and the people can't wake them up, and then all of a sudden the princess who received the statue of the Christ child from Magellan comes and dances around the children, and all of a sudden they're healed and everything's great, and Catholicism comes to save the day. And that's a really great thing growing up, but as an adult, what does it mean for me to come back and realize that this celebration was something that was also contributing to my understanding of Catholicism and my understanding as a Filipino. And so the rest of my thesis goes through me. It's a first-person narrative / a self-reflexive reflection about my learning about about the process of Filipino folk dancing, beginning with how I learned about them, but then moving on to my own replication. So from my small performances in the church, they decided to create an actual Filipino folk dancing troupe with the youth at the church. And so this is a picture of the one show we had, because we fell apart after this. But if you look at the different words, so the name of the company is called Kasarinlan, and Kasarinlan in Tagalog means independent. And what does it mean when the entire dance troupe is dedicated to this idea of the Philippines as an independent nation, and this idea of the Philippines as its own sovereign entity post-Spanish and American colonization. The show is called Sayaw ng Lahi, which means the dance of our nation, and like, again, this idea that as I'm trying to learn about my Filipino-American identity and learn about my own relationship to the Philippines, it's also instilling this idea that the Philippines is a nation in and of itself. Even the picture or the outfits that we were chosen to wear, Barong Tagalogs and the Filipiniana dresses, those are two what are considered traditional dresses, but were actually inspired by like Spanish colonial styles. And so this idea of a lot of this work that I did was really grappling with what is it that I know about being Filipino, and where does it come from, and why is it that I know it in this way. And so after looking at my own experiences, I moved on to what is now known as the National Philippine Folk Dancing Company, the Bayanihan. And Bayanihan, or Bayan, means town, community, or nation, and Bayanihan means this collaborative spirit of a community moving a nipa hut together. So a nipa hut is like this traditional Filipino, sorry, there's a lot of new things. The nipa hut is this traditional Filipino house that's built out in the provinces, in the farms. And Bayanihan is when the community comes together and carries the house from one location to another. And so to name a dance company after the Bayanihan shows that like we are a community together, we are a nation together. But when looking at the book that memorializes the Bayanihan, we see pictures like these, which are the choreographers and the dancers going out into the highlands of Luzon and researching indigenous dances. But they use pictures such as these with indigenous women in the middle, sort of replicating these actions that they will eventually take into dances and replicate for audiences abroad. And so when using this idea of like togetherness and collaborative building, what does it mean when the people that you're studying are seen as other, and the choreographers are actively othering these people through their research? In the book itself, so this is a quote by Isabel Santos, who wrote the book Bayanihan, A Memory of Six Continents. It's a lot. It says, by representing in its repertoire the varied cultural influences in Philippine history and culture, indigenous, Christian, Muslim, ethnic, and other, the Bayanihan has succeeded in homogenizing and synthesizing our fragmented cultural traditions. I highlighted the words homogenizing and synthesizing to show that like the effort of these dances was not necessarily to preserve this culture, but to create one understandable narrative that can be taken abroad and paraded around. And what does it mean when these things are created to, or how do I say this? The Philippines, it's an archipelago of islands that a border was drawn around, and then all of a sudden it was a nation. And so what does it mean when all these efforts are going towards bringing these people together when maybe they weren't meant to be together in the first place? And so when Filipino Americans are engaging in this material, what does it mean to be seeing it as Filipino identity as opposed to the identity of like maybe people that came before you, as a way of like reaffirming and reifying this nationalistic identity. And so a lot of this work was really hard, and I was able to go back to the very beginning of Filipino folk dancing, which was this research done by a master's student at the University of the Philippines, Diliman. Her name is Francisca Reyes Aquino. She was a student who was studying physical education, and the way she did this research, her research was being sponsored at a time when the Philippines was leaving U.S. colonial status and moving it into independence. And so as a grad student, her work was to create this repertoire that could be now taught to different students through physical education. And so looking back at her research, which I actually found in the rock, why is it there? I have no idea. It was really hard to sort of analyze her work and take it with a grain of salt, because so for example, she wrote, "These dances are to preserve Filipino games and folk dances since they are in danger of being displaced, as American folk dances and games are rapidly being introduced." And so her work was to go around the Philippines, collect these dances, and then sort of standardize them so that they could be taught to Philippine students. And this was really incredible work in that she was able to preserve so much, but she also grounded all of these dances in the 5 fundamental positions of ballet. And as we know, ballet does not come from the Philippines. It comes from like a Western style of dance. And so as y'all can also tell, like I'm like sweating because I can't really, what's the word? I don't know how to feel about the fact that, like, yes, she introduced different styles of dance into these things, but also she preserved so much work for the rest of us. And a lot of these dances, if she had not done this work, we would not know a lot of these dances at all. And so moving into, by the end of my research, I had realized that this process was really painful. I didn't really know how to go into it, and I wasn't really prepared to come out of it too. But I realized that it was a really important process to learn about how these dances were formed and then manipulated to hold up this nation-state model that doesn't necessarily support the people that gave the dances that they're parading around. It made me feel kind of really helpless and complicit as a Filipino American who performed these dances, but at the same time, I realized a lot of my hurt had stemmed from the fact that these dances no longer felt authentic to me, that they still had no impact on whether or not I could personally feel comfortable in my Filipino identity. But yeah, I learned something very valuable in this process, and it's not whether these dances are authentic or not where their importance lies. It's their ability to gather people together and to build communities and tell stories across borders. This is something that I realized very late in my thesis that I concluded very nicely in one chapter and then have since been thinking about. But this idea that authenticity, if we're thinking of authenticity as things that are pre-colonial, pre-Spain, pre-American influence in the United States, then these dances are not authentic. But if we understand authenticity to be things that hold a lot of impact on people's real lives and are able to bring people together, then all of these dances are authentic in and of themselves. Dance scholar Esteban Villaruz said, "The obsession to define ourselves sometimes stems not so much from our desire to know ourselves as from our desire to show something for ourselves." And I think this idea of showing something for ourselves, it holds very true to Filipino American communities in that when dealing with a history of colonization, it feels like nothing is ours. It feels like everything that we're giving or that we're sharing with other people was somehow given to us by some other colonial master. But that doesn't mean that they're not real. That doesn't mean that we haven't taken them or put our own influences onto them and had agency within ourselves. And so while these dances have not shown me exactly what Filipino culture is, they have facilitated my community building and my politics around building transnational solidarity. It's helped me really think about what does it mean for me to be performing these dances or learning about these dances while these indigenous people or Muslim people or working class people are still existing within the Philippines. They've shown me the power of storytelling and sharing narratives outside of the written word, and they've most importantly taught me that my identity is not grounded in how much I know about the Philippines, but by the connections and new ideas that I have made in the process of learning. Yeah.
Would anyone like to ask May a question?
I actually have a question. Sorry. No, just sort of based on what I heard you to be saying about like drawing borders around like a series of like islands and calling it a country, and that just sort of like resonated with me being like Nigerian, because that's pretty much what happened with like drawing lines around a bunch of different tribes and naming it a country. And I was also like thinking about like the quote that Charlie had in like one of their slides of like decolonization doesn't necessarily mean erasing every Western influence and just going back, and thinking about like whether Nigeria is a country and if I acknowledge it as such, if it's just sort of like a combination of different people. And I was wondering what you were thinking about like the Philippines.
Yeah.
Along those lines.
So the Philippines has this national language, which is Tagalog, but there are so many different languages within the Philippines. There's like a good couple hundred, and my family actually speaks Ilocano, which is a different one. And so when I think about being Filipino or trying to reclaim Filipino identity, all of my resources are in Tagalog, but that's not my family's like native language. And so I think it's how do I say it? We can use these like borders, and we can use these things that are like the leftovers of colonization as helpful like guiding measures. So like the idea that you can help, like the identity is helpful in that it brings people together. Like identity is helpful in that it creates like words for us to use to describe ourselves. But at the end of the day, like identity can only do so much. And so like this idea of building around a nation isn't as helpful as building around the people around you, or building community around like the differences and similarities between like neighboring communities. I think especially like in order for me to understand what it means to be Ilocano, I also have to understand how like Ilocanos are different from people from like other different communities in like Luzon and other different communities like within the Philippines. And like how do this like idea of like separation also separate us from each other, and how can we build together, or how can I build with other Filipino Americans and learn about their traditions the same way that like I hope that they'll learn about like my Ilocano ones. Yeah.
We have about 10 more minutes. I'm going to ask you all how you want to use that time. Because you were thinking about asking each other questions, but we can.
Maybe that's a good idea. Maybe we could open the floor up to questions for all of us that like might pertain to all of our topics. If that's something you guys are interested in.
I had a question, but I feel like May, you already kind of answered it. But I feel like something that we were all sort of touching on is this idea, you know, like that people have been thinking about since before Shakespeare, that like, okay, if lived experience can never be fully nailed down, and I feel like Charlie, especially some of your collaborators were talking about this, then identity categories at least become like one useful way to try to do that. But how do we reconcile that utility with an awareness of how like many identities have been produced sort of for a public imaginary in the service of colonial power or state violence, and like holding those two things in mind, like what does it mean to reclaim identity, and is identity even something we should be like working toward claiming or reclaiming? But I feel like May, you just answered that, so I don't know.
I think like so I was doing this reading, and it dissected art as the artist, the patron who like sponsors all the art. We always forget that person. and then the audience. And I think something that is really powerful, I think especially in all of our work, is how all of a sudden the patron isn't really there, because we're writing for ourselves, we're writing for our friends, we know who our audience is, and we're able to like make sure that like our work is tailored to a very specific audience. And I think like that's something that is really important, is that like when you're able to produce your own work on your own terms, when there's like no patron to tell you what to do, that like, yeah, I don't know, that garners a lot of agency in the work itself. And like when we take away the importance of art from, or when we don't measure art based on how far it reaches, but who it reaches, I think that's something that's really important.
Yeah, I like really agree with that, because I think that that's something that I really appreciated in like all of our projects is like creating art that's like theater that's inclusive of people of color for people of color, or like exploring like the origins of like traditional folk dancing for like people who like actually participate in them, or like for me, I know it was very important to like write, not just create representation in the characters of the graphic novel, but who is writing the graphic novel, because there are like Black women characters and there are queer Black women characters, but the question is who's writing them, and so whose perspective on like Black womanhood is being shown, and like I don't know, I think that was sort of like really powerful for me.
I also think about like what you were talking about in terms of the violences that can come about from naming categories and like naming identities with labels. I think all of us talked a lot about the importance of personal narrative and individual narrative in identity formation and reaffirmation, and I think that's a very powerful way in which we can disturb categories of identity and start to talk more about individual experiences of identity, because I think more personal stories are harder to turn against a population. Yeah.
And thinking about your question of like reconciling with identities and the violence attached to them, one thing that I think a lot of like what I did in my project, specifically within the capstone, is like I let people decide how they want it to be presented. I let people decide how they want to share their stories, because there is a lot of like empowerment within that. I know like in some of the conversations we had, a lot of folks would be like what do you mean? Like, what do you mean, like, how do I identify? Like, do you mean, like, racially? Do you mean, like, gender? I'm just, like, whatever it means to you. Like, I'm not going to dictate how you wanted to identify yourself. And a lot of the things, though, a lot of people came out thinking, like, I am me. This is who I am. And these are the descriptors that are attached to my identity. These are how people perceive me. But that doesn't mean, like, I identify with it. So it does become a process of reclaiming. I think at the end of the day, it's a process of like reclaiming like who you are and who you want to be by knowing like the histories and ancestry that you come from.
I had a question for like the general like thing, but also like I think Ayo and Anna, you could really speak to this maybe, but like I was wondering if anyone had thoughts about like reproducing old stories versus just creating new stories for yourself. I think especially like using Oshun as like inspiration, or using like Shakespeare as inspiration, and then recreating them in different lights, or more modern or like current lights, versus this idea of like tradition, and like you don't want to like break tradition. Like I was wondering if anyone had thoughts on such things.
I'm thinking about Hamilton, and about aren't we all? But about how like audiences. So I worked briefly for the production company that is producing Hamilton, and it turns out that like obviously a lot of the audience members are white and very wealthy, and like haven't before accessed hip hop or rap. Like they just haven't thought about it or listened to it, and through Hamilton started to listen to different kinds of music, but also consider points of views that were not previously like in their ken. Wow, I've never used that word before. No one has. But I think that maybe modernizing or updating or reclaiming works that already exist, stories that already exist, allow people who didn't previously have access to those stories, sort of like a gateway, like a midpoint between tradition and what they're familiar with. Like I think it's easier. Maybe it's like a way in for audiences to see Othello and to empathize with a Black character is a way in some way. You know what I mean? Like a white audience member empathizing with a Black character in a way that they hadn't thought to before, or they hadn't experienced before, as like a way in for empathy.
Yeah, and I think like just sort of going off of what Anna just said, like I know like for me, like writing Oshun as a different character, I also think I was reading something about like when they made the like all women Ghostbusters remake and people being like, why don't you just like write a new story? And it's like it's easier for people who like don't want to see like a black woman character to just avoid it if it's a new story. But if I say that there's a new Ghostbusters movie, you're like, oh, I know Ghostbusters. Here's all my nostalgic memories from before. And now I'm going to go see Ghostbusters. And even if you go in like, oh my gosh, I can't believe they're doing all women. It's like, it's Ghostbusters. You understand it. And it's sort of like Anna was saying, like a midpoint, like meet me halfway here. And so like, then after that, it's like, all right, maybe like this is not so strange to see like women playing these roles that I thought were previously for men, and like sort of like creating like my character from like a previously existing, like a currently existing sort of deity. It sort of allows, I don't know, I just really like the idea of reimagining and exploring different facets of identity. And so like thinking about like, so if this goddess was a black woman in the United States and she's only 20 years old and these things are happening to her, how would she approach it? And sort of like trying to find the power in like already existing stories. But yeah.
I think that actually the danger and the violence happens when it doesn't go both ways. Like, a lot of people have celebrated Ntozake Shange as like a second Shakespeare. Like her work is incredibly like poetic and beautiful and very, it's like one of those canons that like speaks to the human experience, that kind of thing. But not as many people study her work as Shakespeare's work. People, like everyone is reading Shakespeare's work all across the U.S., right? Like it's just, you're learning it in public school, you're like, you just see it everywhere. There are modern remakes, there's She's the Man, right? You can't avoid it. But just people aren't as familiar with Four Colored Girls as they are with like, I don't know, As You Like It, which is a pretty obscure play, even when you think about it. So I think if it doesn't go both ways, then like if the effort isn't being put in, then like I think it becomes dangerous. But I think there are some moves towards that. They're not as fast or aggressive as I would like, but there's some movement.
I think we're just about at time. Maybe I can ask the panelists to share what you're thinking about now in closing. Just what this conversation has made you think about now.
I feel like I'm thinking about grad school. It's very stimulating. I don't know. I think I'm thinking about sort of the continued importance of first-person writing and all the forms that can take. Like I'm just so compelled by turning a thesis, like May did, into a into this like personal narrative, and sort of like, yeah, what it can mean to use first-person modes as like an intervention in a space that maybe like doesn't expect that.
I think I'm currently thinking about the paper that I have due on Monday about like I'm writing about like decolonizing like medicine in Nigeria, and so like I really appreciated Charlie's quote on like decolonization doesn't necessarily mean rejecting all of Western influence, just sort of reframing like what parts are important to like a community through their methods and like their ways. And I'm also thinking about the like next graphic novel that I'm writing, which is like another goddess. So see me later.
I'm thinking about how I'm pretty much thinking of like how I can expand upon this concept of a sentient archive, especially since it was something that came up in a conversation and then I just coined a term right then on the spot, but also like how to make it much more accessible, because I think the one thing that is dangerous about the archive work that a lot of like the academy does is because it erases, it silences, it becomes more static, and there's a loss of humanity. There's a loss of contribution to the archive that a lot of people in the academy kind of forget. But also I'm thinking about like how I'm going to continue to after like presenting my thesis on Monday, which is pretty much storytelling and talking more about the sentient archive.
Where and when are you presenting your thesis?
I am presenting along with other ethnic studies concentrators in Casper Multipurpose Room. Our section of ethnic studies begins at 10:30, starting with Andy Lee, and that'll be honors thesis all the way till 3 p.m.
Like 3:30. It's a whole day thing. You should come. There's a lot of us.
There's a lot of us. We have 6 honors theses presenting, and I'm gonna forget the capstone. May, Phoebe, someone.
Like a good 15 or
Oh my god.
14.
Victor, someone.
I'm thinking about, as I often do in these conversations, about avoiding tokenization in these forums, in these forms of storytelling. Like, I think it's so important to make sure that these stories are being told and shared, but it also, there's a fine line between making sure they're told and shared and also like actively seeking out identities for the sake of representing them and purely for the sake of representing them. Because I've definitely been there where I've been like cast in something just because they needed an actor of color, like, and it's never a good feeling, and you know why you're there, and it's just, it never feels good. And it's important to have people in spaces, but there needs to be, I think, it just needs to be integrated better, I think, but there's no particular solution for it.
Right now, I'm thinking about my cousin who's like the same year as me, but goes to school on the West Coast at University of San Francisco. He's like going through a time because a lot of people are like critiquing Filipino folk dancing there. But while I'm here being like one of the very few Filipinos at Brown, he's over there where he's like one of the majority of Filipinos. And so sort of thinking about how can my work translate to a different location where Filipino folk dancing is seen as a little more mainstream, a little more widely celebrated, but not as closely engaged with. Yeah.
May, Anna, Charlie, Ao, Lisa, congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you.